I think, you know, we are in the midst of a war in the Ukraine. We can all see on our TVs the terrible human insecurity that's being created by this war for women, children, and for men. And I think this is, you know, on International Women's Day, we think about these women that are now suffering this human insecurity. We're also thinking of women in the post-pandemic conditions, specifically in Africa. I think we still need to come to grips with all the things that has happened during the pandemic. I think there's still a lot that we don't know. But it's also, I think, a wonderful thing today that we can celebrate women's achievements and celebrate them with our speaker, Professor Aili Tripp. It's a wonderful privilege to have you, Aili. She is currently a STIAS Fellow at the University of Stellenbosch. And I just want to introduce her. So Aili is the Wangari Maathai Professor of Political Science and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. Those of you who are here, just mute your microphones, please. She has conducted research on women's movements in Africa for over 30 years, and her work was also very instrumental in my own research.
Did you join, Fenty?
She is the author of many award-winning books, including Seeking Legitimacy. People, some of you, there are microphones that are on. Can you please switch off your microphones? Thank you. She's the author of several award-winning books, including Seeking Legitimacy, Why Arab Autocracies Adopt Women's Rights, Women and Power in Post-Conflict Africa, Museveni's Uganda, African Women's Movements Transforming Political Landscape with Isabel Casimiro and Joy Kosiga and Alice Mungwa, as well as Women and Politics in Uganda. Currently, she's the lead editor of the American Political Science Review. Thank you, Aili, and it's over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the University of Stellenbosch, and thank you, Amanda House, for inviting me. This was a fun paper to research. The title is Africa's Contributions to Global Discourses on Women's Rights.
And this is self.
I think that there's still somebody has their microphone open. Cesanti, oh no, it's closed. Shall I just keep going? Okay. Could you, wait, I think we need the PowerPoint. I'm unable to control the PowerPoint from my end, so perhaps it could be put on. I just can't see it yet. Can other people see the PowerPoint? I can't see it. There you go. All right. Okay. So could we see the next slide, please? So this talk is based on findings in this book, Women's Activism in Africa, that I edited, co-edited with Balgis Badri from the Afad Women's University in Sudan. But it includes chapters from around Africa by activists and academics from throughout the continent, from Sudan to South Africa to Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and so on. So African women leaders have helped shape global norms regarding gender policy for over half a century. As we know, women's rights activism in Africa has had its own trajectories, inspirations, and demands rooted in African struggles for independence, democracy, and against gender-based oppression. My comments today look at the contributions of African women activists to global understandings of political leadership, peace building, gender budgeting, and many other concerns. Okay, next. Next. The late Peg Snyder, who was the founding director, can you go back to the, Late Peg Snyder, who was founding director of UNIFEM, which was a precursor to UN Women, characterized the United Nations as the unlikely godmother of global
evidence is as important. So constantly in the report, you will see the hyperlinks, and that will be provided in the portfolio of evidence. The portfolio of evidence will also provide videos. So if there is...
I'm sorry, I don't know what that is. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Women the world over have relied on the United Nations to help define and coalesce women's concerns, to put forward programs for legislative change, to provide fora for meeting across borders, and to participate in discussions on issues of concern to women's lives. Okay, next. African women activists were visible in planning and running key UN conferences on women. One of the first was this conference on women and economic development in 1972 that was organized by Ida Gindi from Egypt. I'm going to be talking about North Africa as though it's part of Africa. I don't separate North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. The Egyptian National Preparatory Committee for NGOs was led by Aziza Hussein. She helped organize the International Conference on Population and Development that was held in Cairo in 1994. And this was a key conference in helping shift the debate over population control away from the traditional family planning focus on quotas and targets to one that emphasized women's rights and women's health and put women at the center of family planning concerns. Next slide. From the outset, at the time of the preparations for the first UN conference on women in Mexico, Kenyan women like Phoebe Asio had early on lobbied to hold the UN conference on women, and as a result, Kenya then hosted the 1985 conference. The date is wrong there, it should be 85. And the Kenyan Women's Group helped in the planning and running the Nairobi UN conference. African women brought to the fore issues of national liberation and apartheid in South Africa. Next slide. Tanzania's Gertrude Mongella was the General Secretary of the UN Beijing Conference, the fourth conference on UN Conference on Women in 1995. African women once again played a key role in the programming and among other things raised concerns about the girl child, which became one of the 12 critical areas of concern in the core Beijing platform of action. Sierra Leonean Philomena Steady was also one of the key conveners of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. Next slide. From the very outset, women from African countries were visible in these international venues. Jean-Martin Cissé became the first woman to be president of the UN Security Council when she served as Guinea's permanent representative to the UN from 1972 to 1976. She had also been the General Secretary of the Conference on African Women and had been active in the Ghanaian women's movement, serving as Guinea's representative to the UN Committee on the Status of Women a little bit later. Liberia's Angie Brooks, whose funeral I attended in Liberia in 2007. She was the only African female president of the UN General Assembly, and this was in 1969, and only the second woman from any country to hold this position. She was one of many women to serve on Liberia's Supreme Court, and I'm proud to say that she received a master's degree from my Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also a law degree from my university. Women's rights activist Anna Tibayuka from Tanzania served later as an Undersecretary General of the UN, and she was the Executive Director of the UN Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, from 2006 to 2010. She was the second highest ranking African woman in the UN system after Dr. Asha Rose Migiro, who was also another Tanzanian who served as the Deputy UN Secretary General. Next slide. As did as is now Nigeria's Amina Mohammed. Next slide. Okay, so oops, I think I lost, here we go. Sorry. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka was the executive director of UN Women until fairly recently, from 2013 to 2021, with also the rank of Undersecretary General of the UN. Under Mlambo-Ngcuka's leadership, UN Women worked to launch the He for She campaign, which is a global effort that seeks to involve men and boys in achieving gender equality by taking action against negative gender stereotypes and behaviors. And she also welcomed or helped increase the participation of women in peacekeeping operations. Pamela Patton, who's also here, is a Mauritian British lawyer, women's rights activist, and currently serves as the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and also Undersecretary General of the UN. She was appointed in 2017 and succeeded Zainab Bangura, who's also pictured here from Sierra Leone. Bangura is now the Director General of the United Nations Office in Nairobi. Next slide. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala became the Director General of the World Trade Organization in 2021, having served earlier as the Managing Director of the World Bank Operations. Next slide. African women are also have led regional associations, regional bodies, such as the African Union Commission. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was elected the first chairperson of the African Union Commission in 2012 to 2017. This is the organization that took over from the Organization of African Unity. And now she's currently a minister in the South African government as Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. Next slide. So, as you can see, these are, I'm going through a lot of different women, and I could go on for a long time. But the African women have played key roles in key international organizations and regional organizations, and have had influence, and a large number of these women have come out of the women's movement in their home countries. The All Africa Women's Conference was one of the 6 organizations that drafted the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Treaty, which is the most important treaty on women's rights. And this All African Women's Conference was the only regional organization that was involved in drawing up the treaty. And African member states continue to be part of the monitoring international group for CEDAW. Next slide. Next slide. As early as the 1970s, African women's organizations pressed the UN Economic Commission for Africa to establish a training center for women, which was formed in Addis Ababa. It became the first regional center in the world and soon became a model for the UN system as other such centers were established. The center played a major role in articulating the role of women and ensuring the formulation of relevant policies, conventions, and charters from a women's perspective. The center was heavily involved in planning and facilitating women's participation at various conferences, including the Beijing conference and related activities. Next slide. The Association of African Women for Research and Development, AWORD, was formed in 1976, and it was the first regionally based organization of women in Africa, research-based. In part, its creation was a result of some of the experiences African women encountered, first at the UN Conference on Women held in Mexico in 1975, but then at the 1976 Wellesley Conference, where, and this is in the US, where many of the African participants, namely Nawala Sadawi from Egypt and Fatima Mernissi from Morocco, pushed back against what they felt was an attempt by Western women who were attempting to set the agenda in ways that didn't exactly match with their priorities. And so they then formed, or were part of the effort to form AWORD, the Association of African Women for Research and Development. And this organization promoted research networking among African women scholars. And in part, the incentive was to offset this, what they felt, the perceived domination of research on women in Africa by Western scholars, and to tackle the dearth of research on women in Africa and the lack of availability of work by African scholars on women at the time. Next slide. When African women representatives came to the UN Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980, African women representatives had prepared a draft policy proposals regarding women in development, having worked on them in advance at a Lusaka regional conference. The proposals formed the basis of the Women in Development section of the Organization of African Unity's 1982 Lagos Plan of Action, and it laid out a strategy for women's economic empowerment involving education, claims to administrative and political power, and the need for research, the exchange of information regarding economic changes as they affected women, and ways to build strategic collaborations between governments, international agencies, and women's NGOs. As Devaki Jain explained in her history of the women's involvement in the UN, quote, African women were several steps ahead of the rest of the world's women during the 1960s and 1970s, end quote, because they were already carrying out research and making policy recommendations directed at government officials and regional institutions. Next slide. Women such as Jacqueline Kizerbo had already developed the idea of gender mainstreaming in 1960, okay, as early as 1960, at a meeting of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, where she spoke of the importance of maintaining, quote, a double stream to have specific support for women while at the same time trying to involve them in the mainstream of decisions and actions, end quote. Next slide. African women have also been world leaders in the area of female political representation, changing global expectations in this area. In fact, across the continent, the rates of women in parliament tripled between 1990 and 2010. Women's movements were key advocates of these changes in political representation. Rwanda's women, as many of you know, Rwanda's women parliamentarians were the first in the world to exceed the 50% of the legislative seats, and today they claim 61% of the legislative seats, which is the highest share in the world. There are female speakers of the House in 1/5 of African parliaments, and this is higher than the world average, which is 14%. Women began to claim positions in key ministries, not just youth and community development and culture and so on, but also in ministries of defense, of foreign affairs, of finance, and so on across the continent. Also, increasing numbers of women began to run for executive positions after 2010 for the presidency. And African women activists played an important role in advancing the debates regarding women's political leadership, and in particular the use of quotas. Next slide. Another area that first generated considerable momentum in Africa and then spread beyond the continent has been the adoption of gender budgets, or attempts to make the gender implications of spending priorities in the national budget more explicit, and to improve the status of women by bringing attention to the gender gaps. After the 1995 Beijing 4th UN Conference on Women, many African countries, starting with Tanzania and Uganda, adopted women's budgets designed along the lines of South Africa's 1994 budget exercise, which itself was inspired by the 1984 budgets of federal and state governments in Australia. Approximately 40 gender-sensitive budget initiatives were underway by 2002, And the largest number of these were in Africa, in countries like Uganda, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, and Tanzania. Gender budgeting subsequently spread from Africa to Europe, and the European Union has endorsed this as an approach. In fact, today, over half the European Union countries have adopted gender quotas. And just to give an example, there's a study that's been done in Belgium, and Belgium is one of the countries that's adopted gender budgeting quite successfully. It was adopted after a high-level 2001 conference that was organized by the Ministry of Development Cooperation. The ministry realized that it would be hypocritical to ask donor recipients to implement gender budgeting while they're not adopting it themselves in Belgium. And so they then started working together with the Ministry of Employment and Equal Opportunity, and subsequently they launched the Belgian Federal Project on Gender Budgeting. So African experiences with this form of mainstreaming have become an important factor in increasing their popularity globally. Next slide. Women activists' efforts to improve women's economic status have focused on improving their access to credit and microcredit, struggles for legal change around land and inheritance, and, as we mentioned, gender budgeting. Today, women in Africa are leaders in business globally, and women's networks of businesswomen have played a role in this. Africa is a world leader when it comes to women starting businesses, with almost equal numbers of male and female entrepreneurs on average. In countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia, the number of women entrepreneurs exceeds that of men, according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Overall, there are proportionately more entrepreneurs, like I said, in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And countries like Uganda, Botswana, Ghana have had proportionally more women business owners in the world, according to also the MasterCard Index of Women Entrepreneurs. 1 in 4 board members are female in Africa, which places the continent ahead of other world regions, including Europe, where the figure is 23%. And in Latin America, it's only 7%, according to the McKinsey Global Institute. Next slide. Women's economic involvement in Africa also helped inspire the formation of Women's World Banking, the first such international lending organization. The successful Ghanaian agribusiness entrepreneur, marmalade maker, philanthropist, industrialist Esther Oklu pioneered the idea of formalizing local women's credit associations. And Oklu worked with Ella Bhatt, who you might know from the Self-Employed Women's Organization in India, SEWA. She worked with Ella Bhatt, and Ella Bhatt was also a member of parliament in India, and also with Michaela Walsh, who was a New York investment banker. And together, these 3 women formed Women's World Banking in 1979. And as of 2005, Women's World Banking was providing financial services to millions of women. And today it operates in 45 countries around the world. It was a precursor to the Grameen Bank, which was formed in 1980, BRAC, which then came Action, and other such popular micro-lending initiatives. Women's role in finance continues to this day. A Ugandan woman, Eddie Gold-Mundi, became the first woman to direct a top Africa-wide bank in 2008. And under her leadership, the Bank of Africa strengthened its financial position, growing its assets by 91%, deposits by 85%, and loans and advances by 74%. Next slide. African countries have, on average, more constitutional provisions addressing women's rights than any other world region. And I could say much more about that, but I just want to give you an overview of some of the different areas that we've seen leadership from Africa. The environment is another such area. Environmental movements have become another important arena of female mobilization. One of the earliest such movements was the Greenbelt movement that was led by Wangari Maathai, a biologist and women's rights leader who won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2004. And Matai pioneered the links between development, environmental sustainability, democracy, and human rights. And she was already making these connections as early as the 1970s. And I should mention I took my name from my professorship from her in her honor. Okay, next slide, please. African women's contributions to policy have also been visible in the area of peacemaking and peacebuilding, given that so many wars have been located on the continent, especially between 1990 and 2000. Women's organizations met in Windhoek, Namibia in 2000 and drafted a document that became the basis of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that required women to be involved in all peacemaking activities at all levels. There have been subsequent resolutions, but this was the key one that got the ball rolling. When Namibia brought the resolution to the floor, there was a lot of pushback. Ambassador Selma Ashipala Musavyi, Namibia's deputy permanent representative to the UN at the time, recalled the reaction in the UN Security Council. Quote, following the introduction of the theme on women, peace, and security, what followed then was a minute of silence, followed by a mix of laughter, plain astonishment, accompanied by sophisticated ridicule. The feeling, she said at the time, was that the topic of choice had no place in the UN Security Council, but rather should be discussed by the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly. However, due to our insistence and the push from civil society organizations and other member states in our camp, the Security Council eventually deliberated on the topic, and the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted, and the rest is history. Women's rights language have been included in more peace agreements in Africa than anywhere else in the world. This is by per treaty, per peace accord, and this language has often been a precursor to constitutional reforms. And indeed, we've seen extensive provisions for women's rights in post-conflict constitutions that have then paved the way for future legislative reforms that incorporate women's rights. And so this is why you see, I mentioned that there are more constitutional provisions around women's rights in African constitutions, and this is one of the main reasons why you see that. It's also one of the reasons why you see more adoption of gender quotas and higher rates of representation of women in post-conflict countries that have gone through major conflict, compared with countries that have not. Next slide, please. Many of the changes in thinking about gender-based violence globally also came out of the experiences within a conflict, as these sharpened the awareness of the nature and the gravity of the problem. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, their judgment against the former Rwandese mayor Jean-Paul Akayesu in 1898 for his, 1898 for his role in the Rwandan genocide, helped to fundamentally transform existing norms regarding gender violence, not only within Africa, but globally. For the first time, rape and sexual violence were explicitly recognized as an act of genocide and a crime against humanity. 2 of the 3 judges in the case were from Africa, Judge Laeti Kama from Senegal and Nabanethem Pillay from South Africa. And Pillay is known, among other things, as having founded the international women's rights organization Equality Now, which works to protect and promote human rights of women and girls around the world. So the last slide, please. Oh, I think we need to go a little bit further. I think I've maybe missed 1 or 2. Sorry about that. Next slide. And one more slide. Here we go. Okay. Back to the concluding slide, please. If we can do that. Okay, great. So just to wrap up, as African women's movements have taken advantage of changing international gender norms and transnational feminist movements to advance their own agendas domestically, they also have influenced global understandings and implementation of women's rights. And these influences are especially evident in UN agencies, policies, and conferences. African women have been leaders and have been influential, particularly in areas that have to do with political representation of women, advancing women as economic actors, and adopting strategies that promote peace and social justice, gender justice. These developments speak to broader changes in global feminisms. Non-Western countries today have in fact claimed much of the momentum of feminist and women's rights advocacy globally. Global feminism is much more of a South-centered movement than ever before, and African women leaders have helped significantly in bringing about this transformation. So thank you very much. I welcome some discussion and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aili, for that really fascinating history. I think very often we see little bits of the history, but when we see it chronologically, like you have showed us today, it is amazing the leadership that came from Africa and influenced all these international organizations. So thank you for that. I also want to say that the journal Agenda has just released the Beijing Plus 25 special issue. And in that issue, there's an interview with Phumzile Mlambo Nguka about the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action in Africa and articles on the achievements in Africa. So for those of you who are interested. But I think it's wonderful today that we can celebrate these achievements and that they are so numerous for the continent. I'm now opening it up for questions, so you can raise your hand or put questions in the chat box. Let's see if there's anything. So right now there are no questions, but let me ask one. Aili, your research on social movements in Africa, can you maybe tell us a bit about transnationalism and how that sort of influence social movements and well, specifically women's movements in Africa?
It's a very broad question.
It is.
Yeah, but I think that let's just pick one area, because I think one of the areas that is a real standout for mobilization is this area of peace building. And that's partly a function of the fact that there just have been so many conflicts. But this is, like I showed or explained in my talk, women from Namibia, but also other parts of the world. It wasn't just Namibia, but they played a key role in that, pushing that 1325 and getting it through, because at that time Namibia was on the Security Council chairing it. So they were in a strategic position to do that. And they'd had this conference in Windhoek earlier that then helped them prepare for the pushing the 1325. And as a result, there's been much more attention. I mean, it's woeful in terms of actual, changes. The numbers of women actually at peace talks, and the numbers of women that are, involved in peace building activities in the formal level is still just miserable. And it's an area that it doesn't move. It doesn't budge very much. But because of the attention, and I think some donor interest and so on, there really have been many networking initiatives, especially at the regional level. We don't often we talk a lot about global and we talk about local mobilization, but at the regional level, there's been mobilization of women in the Horn of Africa, the Mano River Women's Network in West Africa between Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea and Ivory Coast. So there have been these regional initiatives that have been really key and have played a really substantial role in bringing about peace and in advocating for peace and sharing strategies. There's been a lot of work now in the Great Lakes region. Again, also more networking in South Sudan and Uganda and DRC. Women have shared strategies and learn from one another at the regional level. And so, these are all very important initiatives that I think are are examples of how the women are working at these different levels of the global, regional, and then domestic.
Yes, thank you for that, because I think that is really important and interesting initiative around peace and peace building. So yeah, thank you for that. We have a hand. Janet, go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Professor Tripp. I was so happy to read your works. You have this, huge scholarship. I wanted to ask, I'm researching on women representation, and I have seen you have written quite a number of things. Yes, so I wanted to ask, is it time for us to move? Should there be a paradigm shift from researching on descriptive representation of women to substantive representation, or is there still chance? Should we still research on descriptive representation of women, say these, higher institutions? I don't know if my question is clear, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for the question. No, that's a very important question, because you're right that there's been much more focus on what are the numbers, how many do countries have quotas, what kind of quotas do they have, how high is the representation, and part of that is because it's been easy to quantify and easy to count. But I think it's much harder to figure out an agenda that actually looks at substantive representation, which refers to the extent to which women's representation leads to the actual adoption of policies, and that's a much harder hill to climb, and it's harder to research because one has to then define what one means by substantive representation. Is it the representation of the individual women parliamentarians, or is it the representation of women's movement, or who gets to determine what that actually means? And so it can definitely be done, and very little has been done comparatively. There's quite a bit more now done in the Latin America and Europe, certainly, but in Africa, you're right. There's a real gap, and it's something that people need to look at, not just within countries, but really across countries as well. One of the issues for me is that this is not just up to women. I mean, this is, why should the burden be put on women to focus on this kind of legislation? It really is a question for the parties and for Parliament and for Ministry of Gender and everyone else that's involved. This is not just for women parliamentarians to focus on, but it is true that often women parliamentarians are the ones that have advocated for legislation around women's rights, and so for that reason the question gets asked. But I think we have to ask the question more broadly. What are the parties doing for women? What are the governments doing for women? Not just what are the women doing?
Thank you for raising that, Aili, because I'm actually now working on a project that is looking exactly at parties, because we keep thinking that if you have women in government, in parliaments, that they will set the agenda. But the point is, what space is there? So we're looking at the multi-party caucus, and we're looking at the annual Women's Parliament. And what the research so far has shown is that the party dynamics between where you have a dominant party, specifically looking at South Africa, one-party dominance, makes, and you have a very strong women's wing like the ANC Women's League, then it becomes nearly impossible for other parties to be involved in setting a gender agenda. And the annual Women's Parliament has become completely captured by the Women's League, so that the issues that get discussed are not the issues that will lead to policy making. So I think it's a very good point you mentioned, that we need to look at party dynamics, because, you know, this is how women get into the quota, and that is how they get voted in, and then we expect them to give us substantive representation. But we need to look at what does the space actually allow them. Yeah. So Janet, thanks for that question.
Yeah. And just to follow up there, I mean, I think that women, just like men, are under party discipline, and so that they're very much at the mercy of what the party leadership decides on a lot of issues. And so it's not just up to them as individuals. I mean, they can certainly advocate. The other piece of the puzzle is really the role of the women's movement and whether they are actually pushing for these changes, because really, even, you know, if you just leave it up to parties, not much may happen. They need to be pushed, and the push really has to come from society, not from it. You know, women's parliamentarians can do so much, but there has to be something else motivating them besides just the women parliamentarians.
Absolutely. I mean, that link with the women's movement is so crucial. Gretchen sent us a question. Do you see a next frontier where African women will be at the forefront? Are younger women in Africa today concerned about other issues?
Oh, it's so hard to generalize for all. You know, I've been working on a project in Mauritania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, and so and even for those countries, it's hard to generalize. But one of the interesting things that's come out of the interviews is that younger women are engaged, but, you know, a broader range of issues. I mean, the issues of reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues. So there is, you know, some of the issues haven't quite hit them in the same way. So, for example, in Uganda, there was a recent succession act that had to do with inheritance that was passed. But again, it was more that, you know, it was older women who had confronted that issue more directly were the ones that were pushing that legislative change. I think younger women also have, what I'm seeing, at least in these countries that I'm describing, is that their strategies are, some of them are interested in legal change, but much more they're interested in kind of direct action. So, for example, take them kind of Me Too type activities, protesting gender-based violence and sexual harassment, but actually taking direct action and changing, for example, in Uganda, they changed some of the university policies around sexual harassment as a result of efforts by women's rights activists. And so, but again, it's not waiting for some kind of piece of legislation to save them, but really trying to change the things in a more immediate sense. So that's something I'm seeing as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Gretchen. And I think we have to also look at the digital type of activism from younger women, right? So they're more connected. SARS, for example, in Nigeria, and in our case, hashtag Fees Must Fall, and so on. And I think what I find about them is that they are, many of them are embracing feminism. They see themselves as feminists, which an older generation of women, anyway, in the South African case, did not do. And so they are also, I think there's a disconnect between the sort of the nationalist agendas of women who join parliament and the more radical agendas of younger feminists. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. At your points about social media are really well taken. Yes, for sure. And people are sharing ideas and connecting across borders.
Gretchen, thank you for posting a link to an article on substantive and symbolic representation. We will surely look at that. Are there any other questions? Now, I think that this is also important in terms of knowledge production and where knowledge and how knowledge is produced, and creating an archive. Because I mean, your talk here today, Aili, was a form of an archive, and I really think, you know, it helps to resist against erasure, because so often the knowledge produced in Africa, and specifically, the global South, but Africa specifically, becomes erased. And I think this is that we need to guard against that erasure. And I think this is also, young women now are they're producing novels, they're producing poetry, they're producing all kinds of other forms of knowledge. That's really very important and contributes to this knowledge production from the South. Anybody else wants to ask a question, contribute something? Well, let me thank you then for being here, and for Aili, for your fascinating seminar. I really think it was a good way to really celebrate International Women's Day amidst all the mayhem in the world. So thank you for that. And oh, there's a hand. Yes, I can't see who it is, but please go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Maybe they were saying goodbye.
Well, I'm giving it a few more seconds. Can you ask your question or say what you want to say? Or maybe you, like Aili said, you're just waving. I don't know. But thank you, Aili, for the presentation, and for you who were all here present today for joining in this seminar. And I hope you have a good rest of the International Women's Day, wherever in the world you are. It's already like nearly 2 o'clock in South Africa, but for some of you it's probably earlier or later. So enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Hope to see you soon again. Bye. Bye.